The image that the American West of 1885 projects in the popular imagination is one of uniform austerity. Rough timber, canvas, iron cookware, and men in dusty clothes eating beans from a tin plate under an open sky. That image is accurate for the bunkhouses, the cattle drives, and the homesteads. It is not accurate for a specific category of structure that existed at the same moment on the same landscape. Structures whose contents, documented by historians at the Wyoming State Archives, the Montana Historical Society, and the National Park Service, would be more at home in a Chicago brownstone or a St. Louis townhouse than in any picture of the frontier that Hollywood ever produced. Inside the mansions of the major cattle barons of 1885, there were French champagnes in temperature-controlled cellars, Brussels carpets shipped by rail from the east, parlor organs, imported wallpapers, Chinese porcelain, and in at least one documented Wyoming club that served as the social headquarters of the cattle aristocracy, a trained French chef preparing meals for members whose combined net worth exceeded the annual budget of several Western territories combined. None of this is inference or romanticization. It is the documented material record of what the cattle bonanza of the 1870s and 1880s produced at its apex. 1 year before the winter of 1886 to 1887 erased most of it from the landscape. In this video, you will discover the specific economic arithmetic that transformed men who had arrived in the West with modest capital into millionaires within a single decade. The documented contents of the Cheyenne Club in Wyoming, which functioned as the operational center of the cattle aristocracy, and whose inventory reads like the menu of a Parisian restaurant rather than anything associated with the frontier. The specific role that the Transcontinental Railroad played, not in moving cattle, but in delivering the consumer goods that made baronial domestic life possible, 2,000 miles from the nearest city capable of producing them, and the precise moment at which all of it became simultaneously the most concentrated private wealth in the history of the American West and the most fragile. That last point connects directly to something that happened the following year and that the channel has already covered in detail. To understand what a cattle baron's mansion contained in 1885, you first need to understand the specific financial logic that built it, because the mathematics of the cattle bonanza of the 1870s and 1880s were so extreme that historians have consistently struggled to convey them without sounding like exaggeration. Louis Atherton, whose 1961 study, The Cattle Kings, published by the University of Nebraska Press, remains one of the most rigorously documented histories of the cattle aristocracy, traced the basic arithmetic that drove the entire industry. Texas Longhorns purchased from depleted ranches in South Texas in the early 1870s could be acquired for between $3 and $5 per head. Driven north along the trails to the railroad shipping points at Abilene, Ellsworth, and Dodge City, and from there shipped by rail to the slaughterhouses of Chicago. Those same animals sold for between $25 and $40 per head. A man who could finance the purchase of a few hundred head in Texas and cover the cost of the drive north could clear a profit margin of several 100% on a single season's work. A man who could do it with several thousand head and who could then reinvest those profits into land and breeding stock on the northern ranges of Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas, where the grass was free under the open range system and the carrying costs were minimal, could accumulate a fortune in the range of hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars within a decade. By 1885, that arithmetic had been running long enough to produce a distinct social class with the financial resources to impose on the frontier the material conditions of Eastern upper-class life. And the specific technology that made those material conditions possible was not cattle management or land acquisition. It was the railroad. Leave your like here if you had never considered that the Transcontinental Railroad's most culturally significant cargo was not wheat, cattle, or immigrants, but the consumer goods that turned a Wyoming rancher's house into something indistinguishable from the interior of a well-furnished home in Philadelphia or Boston. By 1885, The Union Pacific and its connecting lines had made it possible to order furniture, carpets, wallpaper, wine, canned goods, musical instruments, books, and household equipment from suppliers in Chicago, St. Louis, New York, or even Europe, and receive delivery at the nearest railroad depot within weeks. The Montgomery Ward Mail Order Catalog, which had been operating since 1872, offered hundreds of domestic goods to customers anywhere along the rail network. What this meant for a cattle baron operating a major ranch in Wyoming or Montana was that the interior of the main house on the ranch could be furnished and supplied to a standard that was independent of the frontier location. The distance between the ranch headquarters and the nearest city was irrelevant to what arrived inside the house once the railroad reached the nearest depot. The exterior of the building might be timber framing in a windswept landscape. The interior could be, and in the most prosperous cases was, something that a visitor from New York would recognize immediately as belonging to the domestic world she had left behind. The Grand Course Ranch National Historic Site in Deer Lodge, Montana, preserved and documented by the National Park Service, offers the most completely intact physical record available of what a major cattle baron's domestic establishment looked like in this period. Conrad Course, a Danish-born immigrant who built one of the largest cattle operations in Montana through the 1860s and 1870s, expanded and furnished the main ranch house through the 1880s in a manner that the National Park Service's curatorial documentation records in detail. The main house contains Victorian parlor furniture, a formal dining room with imported china and silverware, upstairs bedrooms furnished with carved wooden bedroom sets, and domestic equipment throughout the house that reflects purchasing from Eastern suppliers rather than frontier improvisation. Augusta Course, Conrad's wife, managed the household, and the records she left behind document the specific labor of maintaining a domestic establishment of this quality in a remote Montana location. The organization of the kitchen, the management of the ice house that preserved food through the summer months, the oversight of the household staff, and the coordination of supply orders with the railroad depot in Deer Lodge. The ice house itself is a detail that connects the baronial domestic interior to the specific logistics of frontier luxury. Before mechanical refrigeration, which did not become commercially available until the following decade, keeping perishable food in a Montana summer required a structure specifically designed to store blocks of ice cut from frozen rivers during the winter and insulated with sawdust to last through the warm months. A major ranch establishment maintained an ice house as a standard outbuilding, and the labor of cutting, hauling, storing, and replacing that ice was a significant annual undertaking that the accounts of ranch operations in this period record alongside the labor costs of the cattle operation itself. The ability to preserve meat, dairy products, and imported delicacies through the summer was not a minor domestic convenience. It was the physical infrastructure that made the dining table of a cattle baron's mansion function as a dining table rather than as a survival station. The social and commercial headquarters of the Wyoming cattle aristocracy was not any single ranch, but an institution in the city of Cheyenne that has been documented extensively by Wyoming historians, including T.A. Larson in his History of Wyoming and in the collections of the Wyoming State Archives. The Cheyenne Club, established in 1880, was designed from its inception as an institution that would make the social and business environment of the major Eastern clubs available to the cattle barons operating in Wyoming territory. The membership was drawn primarily from the owners and managers of the largest cattle operations in the region, a significant proportion of whom were British and Scottish investors who had brought European capital into the American cattle industry during the boom years of the late 1870s and early 1880s. The club maintained a wine cellar stocked with French and German wines and champagnes, a billiard room, a reading room supplied with newspapers and periodicals from the East and from Europe, a formal dining room operated by a trained cook capable of producing meals that reflected the culinary standards members associated with comparable establishments in London or Edinburgh, and residential accommodations for members passing through Cheyenne. The initiation fee and annual dues placed membership beyond the reach of working cowboys and small operators. The club was a financial and social threshold that sorted the cattle aristocracy from the rest of the industry with the same efficiency as a locked door. The British and Scottish presence in the Cheyenne Club and in the Wyoming cattle industry more broadly reflects one of the most significant and least popularly known aspects of the cattle bonanza of the 1880s. Gene Gressley, in his 1966 study Bankers and Cattlemen, documented the scale of foreign investment in the American range cattle industry during this period with a precision that establishes it not as a minor supplement to American capital, but as a structural element of the entire enterprise. Scottish investment trusts, formed by Edinburgh and Dundee investors, attracted by the profit margins that reports from the American West had made famous in British financial circles, poured capital into Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado cattle operations through the late 1870s and into the 1880s. The Swan Land and Cattle Company, organized as a Scottish joint stock company and incorporated in 1883, operated at its peak with approximately 100,000 head of cattle across its Wyoming and Nebraska ranges. The Prairie Cattle Company, another Scottish enterprise, controlled ranges in Colorado, New Mexico, and the Texas Panhandle. These were not modest ventures managed from a distance. They were major corporate operations run by salaried managers who lived in the West, conducted business through the Cheyenne Club, and furnished their own residential quarters to a standard that reflected the expectations of the European investor class that owned the companies. The domestic life inside a cattle baron's mansion in 1885 was organized around a household staff whose composition and labor reflected the specific demographic realities of the frontier West, rather than the servant economy of eastern cities. Irish immigrant women, who dominated domestic service in the urban East, were present in Western household employment, but in smaller numbers than in comparable Eastern establishments. Chinese workers, whose presence in the West had been established through the railroad construction era of the late 1860s, and who had dispersed into domestic service throughout the region after the completion of the transcontinental lines, filled a significant proportion of the domestic labor force in major ranch households of the 1880s, serving as cooks, laundry workers, and household staff. The wages paid to these workers, documented in ranch account books that historians have analyzed, were lower than those paid to white domestic workers in the same region for comparable tasks, a differential that reflected the discriminatory labor market conditions of the period rather than any difference in the quality or quantity of the work performed. The kitchen of a major cattle baron's ranch house in 1885 operated with equipment that would be recognizable in any prosperous farmhouse of the period. A large cast iron range fueled by wood or coal, a deep stone or iron sink with hand-pumped water, if a well had been developed near the house, wooden work tables, and the preserved and dried goods that the railroad now made available year-round. What distinguished a baronial kitchen from a homesteader's was not the type of equipment but the scale, the quality of the raw materials available, and the skill level of the person running it. A Chinese cook who had worked in a major San Francisco or Sacramento household before moving to a ranch position in Wyoming or Montana brought culinary knowledge that was substantially more sophisticated than anything available in a sod house kitchen, and the baronial household's access to preserved oysters, tinned goods from European suppliers, fine cuts of beef from the ranch's own herd, imported spirits, and seasonal produce from kitchen gardens that the water supply on a major ranch could sustain made the production of an elaborate meal technically possible in a way that it was not in any other domestic context on the frontier. The parlor of a cattle baron's mansion served the same social function in Wyoming or Montana in 1885 that it served in any middle or upper-class household in the country. It was the room in which the family performed its social identity for visitors, and its contents were selected and arranged to communicate that identity with precision. The Victorian parlor aesthetic of the 1880s, characterized by heavy upholstered furniture, patterned wallpapers, displayed decorative objects, framed photographs and prints, and a central piece of musical furniture, typically a parlor organ or upright piano in households of this economic level, was reproduced in the baronial ranch house through the same mail order and rail freight infrastructure that supplied everything else. The parlor organ that Augusta Corse played in the main house at Deer Lodge was not a frontier improvisation. It was a manufactured instrument ordered from a supplier and delivered to a location 2,000 miles from where it was made, and its presence in that room made a specific statement about the household's relationship to the cultural values of the American mainstream that its owners wanted clearly communicated. The bedroom floors of a major baronial ranch house in 1885 reflected the same logic as the parlor. Eastern materials, frontier location, no compromise between the two. Carved walnut or oak bedroom sets, including a bed, a wardrobe, a washstand with a marble top and a porcelain basin and pitcher, and a dressing table with a mirror, were standard equipment in the master bedroom and guest rooms of a prosperous ranch house of this period. The pitcher and basin system, which required a servant to carry hot water from the kitchen to the bedroom for morning washing and to remove and empty the chamber pot each morning, meant that the absence of indoor plumbing in most ranch houses of this period, even prosperous ones, was managed through labor rather than engineering. Indoor plumbing was spreading through American cities in the 1880s, but had not yet reached most rural establishments, even wealthy ones. A cattle baron's mansion in Wyoming in 1885 was more likely to have a Brussels carpet and a parlor organ than a flush toilet, because the railroad could deliver carpets and organs, but could not deliver the municipal water infrastructure that indoor plumbing required. The hired domestic staff bridged the gap between the material aspirations of the household and the physical limitations of its location through daily labor that is documented in the account books of major ranch establishments, but rarely appears in the popular history of the era. The women who managed these baronial households occupy a position in the historical record that is both better documented and less popularly known than that of the cattle barons themselves, because the household account books, correspondence, and diaries that survive from major ranch establishments of the 1880s were largely produced by women. Augusta Corse at Deer Lodge left behind a body of correspondence and household records that the National Park Service has analyzed in detail. Henrietta King, who assumed management of the King Ranch in Texas following the death of her husband Richard King in April of 1885, oversaw a ranch that at the time of King's death encompassed approximately 600,000 acres, and that she would continue managing and expanding for decades. The domestic interior of the King Ranch headquarters, documented in historical accounts of the period, reflected the same pattern visible at the Corse establishment in Montana. Victorian furnishings and domestic standards maintained in a remote location through the rail freight system and the labor of a permanent household staff. The woman who ran the baronial household was not a passive inhabitant of a space her husband had built. She was the operational manager of a domestic enterprise whose complexity, involving the coordination of staff, the management of food preservation and supply, the maintenance of the physical structure, and the execution of the social entertainment that the household's position in the cattle community required, was comparable in organizational demand to managing a small hotel. Here is the detail that frames everything else in this video with the precision that the historical record demands. The year 1885 was the last full year of the cattle bonanza at its peak. The ranges were overstocked. The grass of the northern plains had been grazed beyond its carrying capacity. The summer of 1886 would be catastrophically dry, weakening the cattle already on the range. And on January 9, 1887, the blizzard that this channel has already documented in detail would arrive across the northern plains and begin erasing in a matter of weeks the material foundation on which the Brussels carpets, the French champagne, the parlor organs, and the Cheyenne Club dining room all rested. The cattle baron's mansion of 1885 was, without its occupants knowing it, a structure at the absolute peak of its existence. Every object inside it, every imported wine, every carved bedroom set, every piece of china ordered from a St. Louis catalog, existed at the precise moment before the arithmetic that had produced them reversed itself permanently. The Grant Course Ranch survived the winter of 1886 to 1887 better than most because Conrad Course had begun winter feeding programs and had invested in more cold-hardy cattle breeds earlier than many of his competitors. But the open range era that had made the baronial scale of that establishment possible did not survive it. The Cheyenne Club declined through the 1890s as the membership's fortunes contracted, and the corporate British cattle companies wound down their American operations following losses that their Edinburgh and Dundee shareholders had not anticipated when they read the profit projections of the early 1880s. The mansion remained. The economic system that had built it did not. If this video showed you an interior of the American West that no Western film ever reconstructed, subscribe to the channel. Next week, the documented record of what the cattle drive cowboys who worked for these barons actually earned, owned, and ate reveals the full distance between the bunkhouse and the mansion that occupied the same ranch in the same year.